Asterisk, the morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Margaret's kitchen window, casting gentle patterns across the worn wooden table where she sat nursing her 3-month-old daughter, Emma. At 32, Margaret had learned that motherhood brought both profound joy and bone-deep exhaustion in equal measure. Her husband Thomas had left at dawn to check the cattle on their small ranch outside of Tucson, leaving her with the peaceful solitude she'd grown to cherish during these quiet feeding times. Asterisk, the year was 1887, and life on the frontier demanded resilience from everyone who chose to call this harsh, beautiful land home. Margaret had arrived from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier as a young bride. Full of romantic notions about the West, reality had been far different from her imaginings, but she'd discovered a strength within herself she never knew existed. Asterisk, as Emma's tiny fingers curled around hers, Margaret found herself lost in the familiar rhythm of morning chores, mentally planned ahead. The bread needed kneading, the garden required watering before the heat became unbearable, and she hoped to finish mending Thomas's work shirt before he returned. Asterisk, it was then that she heard it, a sound so unexpected that she initially thought her tired mind was playing tricks on her. Soft footsteps on the wooden porch, hesitant and careful. Then came the gentle knocking, barely audible above Emma's contented sounds. Asterisk, Margaret's heart quickened. Visitors were rare, and Thomas wasn't expected back until evening. She carefully adjusted her shawl and moved toward the door, Emma still cradled in her arms. Through the glass, she could see the silhouette of a tall figure, but something about the posture seemed ... different, vulnerable perhaps. Asterisk, when she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Before her stood a young Apache warrior, perhaps in his early 20s, with the traditional long black hair and bronze skin of his people. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped her heart. It was what he carried in his arms. Asterisk, wrapped in a piece of worn deerskin, was an infant, clearly no more than a few weeks old. The baby's cries were weak, barely audible, and Margaret could see immediately that the child was desperately hungry and possibly ill. Asterisk, the young man's dark eyes met hers, and she saw in them a depth of worry and love that transcended any cultural divide. He spoke no English, but his meaning was crystal clear. With gentle gestures toward his chest and then to Margaret, he was asking for what she instinctively knew he needed: milk for the dying baby in his arms. Asterisk, in that moment, Margaret's world shifted. She thought of her neighbors, of what Thomas might say, of the tensions that had long existed between the settlers and the Apache people. She thought of the stories she'd heard, the warnings she'd received about trusting any of them. Asterisk, but then she looked again at the baby, ... so small, so helpless, and at the young warrior's face, etched with the universal expression of someone watching a child suffer. In his eyes, she saw not an enemy, but a father, or perhaps an uncle or brother. Desperate to save a life, Asterisk, without hesitation, Margaret stepped back and gestured for him to enter. The relief that washed over his features was immediate and profound. She led him to the rocking chair by the fireplace, the same chair where she'd spent countless hours nursing Emma through her first months of life. Asterisk, the Apache warrior, whom she would later learn was called Joseph by the local trading post, gently placed the infant in her arms. The baby was indeed a boy, with the delicate features of the very young, and Margaret could feel how frighteningly light he was. His skin was warm with fever, and his breathing was shallow. The baby and began to nurse him. The relief was immediate. His tiny mouth latched on with the desperate hunger of the truly starving, and she could feel his small body relaxing as the nourishment flowed into him. Asterisk, Joseph watched with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Margaret had never seen a grown man cry with such open gratitude, and it moved her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She gestured for him to sit on the nearby bench, and he did so, never taking his eyes off the baby, who was now feeding peacefully. Asterisk, as the minutes passed in comfortable silence, Margaret found herself studying Joseph's face. He was younger than she'd initially thought, with kind eyes and hands that moved gently when he reached out to stroke the baby's dark hair. There was nothing threatening about him, only love and desperate hope. Asterisk, when the baby had drunk his fill and drifted into what appeared to be the first peaceful sleep he'd had in days, Margaret carefully handed him back to Joseph. But as she did so, she made a decision that would change all their lives. Asterisk, she gestured for Joseph to wait, then went to the kitchen and prepared a simple meal. Bread with butter and honey, milk, and some of the vegetable soup she'd made the day before. When she returned, Joseph's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like wonder. Asterisk, as he ate gratefully, Margaret found herself thinking about the baby. One feeding wouldn't be enough. The child needed regular nourishment to recover fully, and she suspected his mother was either dead or unable to care for him. The thought of this innocent child dying from starvation was unbearable to her. Asterisk, using gestures and the few Spanish words they both seemed to know, Margaret managed to communicate an invitation that surprised even herself. She pointed to the baby, then to her breast, then made gestures indicating the passage of time, days, weeks. She was offering to nurse the child until he was strong enough to survive on other foods. Asterisk. Joseph's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He stood and bowed deeply, his hands pressed together in a gesture of profound gratitude. Then he did something that would remain etched in Margaret's memory forever. He gently took her hand and pressed it to his heart, then to the baby's chest, and finally to his own forehead. It was a blessing, she realized. Or perhaps a promise. Asterisk, and so began one of the most extraordinary periods of Margaret's life. Every morning for the next 6 weeks, Joseph would arrive at dawn, carrying the baby she had begun to think of as little William, after her own father. She would nurse both Emma and William while Joseph sat quietly nearby, sometimes helping with small chores around the house, sometimes just watching with the devoted attention of someone witnessing a miracle. Asterisk, Thomas had been shocked when he returned that first evening to find his wife explaining the situation. But when he saw the baby, so much healthier after just 1 day of proper feeding, and when he met Joseph's grateful, respectful demeanor, his heart softened. Thomas was a practical man, and he could see that this was simply the right thing to do. Asterisk, the neighbors, when they inevitably found out, had mixed reactions. Some were scandalized that Margaret would allow an Apache into her home, let alone nurse his child. But others, particularly the women who were mothers themselves, understood completely. Mrs. Henderson from the nearby farm brought extra vegetables. Mrs. O'Brien sent over baby clothes that her own children had outgrown. Asterisk, as the weeks passed, Margaret watched little William transform from a weak, failing infant into a robust, bright-eyed baby who smiled and cooed just like Emma. She found herself falling in love with him, just as she had with her own daughter. His presence filled a space in her heart she hadn't even known was empty. Asterisk, Joseph, meanwhile, became a familiar and welcome presence in their home. He proved to be skilled with his hands, helping Thomas repair fencing and assisting Margaret with tasks that required strength she lacked. He was gentle with Emma, who seemed to sense his kindness and would reach for him with her chubby hands. Asterisk, but Margaret knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. Joseph's people were preparing to move to a different area, following the seasonal patterns that had sustained them for generations. The day would come when he would have to take little William and leave. Asterisk, that day arrived on a crisp October morning. Joseph came to the door carrying not just little William, but also a beautiful basket woven from pine needles and decorated with intricate patterns. Inside the basket was a small blanket, soft as a cloud, that he had somehow acquired for the baby. Asterisk, little William was now a healthy, thriving child of nearly 3 months. His cheeks were round and pink, his eyes bright and alert. When Margaret held him that final time, he smiled up at her with the trusting joy of a child who had known only love and care. Asterisk, the goodbye was harder than Margaret had anticipated. She pressed her cheek to little William's soft head and whispered a prayer for his safety and happiness. Joseph watched with understanding in his eyes, and when she finally handed the baby back to him, he spoke the only English words she ever heard him say. "Thank you, Mother." Asterisk, those words stayed with her long after Joseph and little William disappeared. Down the dusty road, Margaret realized that in caring for this child, she had discovered something profound about love, that it knows no boundaries of race or culture, that kindness given freely comes back to us in ways we never expect. Asterisk, years later, when Emma was a young woman, she would often ask her mother to tell the story of the Apache baby, and Margaret would always end it the same way. by saying that sometimes the greatest gifts we receive are the opportunities to give love to those who need it most. Asterisk, she never saw Joseph or little William again, but she never forgot them, and in her heart she carried the certainty that somewhere out there a young man was living a full and happy life, because sometimes when we open our hearts and our homes to those in need, we discover that love truly is the most powerful force in the world. Asterisk, in the evening light of her later years, sitting in that same rocking chair where she had nursed 2 babies with equal love, Margaret would smile and remember the morning when kindness knocked on her door, and how answering that call had made her not just a mother, but something even more precious, a mother to any child who needed her love.